introduce for you Dr. Georges Benjamin. He is the Executive Director of the American Public Health Association since 2002. He's a board certified in internal medicine and a fellow of the American College of Physicians and also the National Academy of Public Administration, a fellow emeritus at the American College of Emergency Physicians, and an honorary fellow of the Royal Society of Public Health. He's the author of more than 100 scientific articles and book chapters, and he has been voted by the Modern Healthcare magazine as among the 100 most influential people in healthcare 10 years in a row. So, Dr. Benjamin.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Well, listen, thank you very much for allowing me to spend a little bit of time with you today. I'm going to do the obligatory, I don't have any financial conflicts because I'm poor and I'm broke. I'm in public health, you know what that's like, right? So just that, you know, I always try to do that. I do have a bias, and it's an extraordinary bias. I care about people's health, and I'm uncompromising about that. Sometimes I get in trouble doing that. Life's tough, though. Let me first define what I do. You know, I spent most of the first half of my time in medicine practicing emergency medicine. And one of the more painful revelations was understanding that 80% of what makes you healthy occurs outside the doctor's office. Doesn't mean that I still don't salivate when someone twists their ankle, but when I moved into doing public health, you know, I had to recognize that I had to understand what it was, and it's obviously broad population-based approach to health. And I know this is kind of a mixed crowd, so I thought I would put up the definition of public health, which comes from a consensus study at then the Institute of Medicine, now the National Academy of Medicine. We looked at public health, and this is kind of the definition of public health. We approach the health threats by trying to define what the problem is, identifying risk and protective factors, you know, looking at prevention strategies. We're really high into prevention, trying to stop things really way upstream, and then trying to get it spread in a widespread way and trying to adopt it. So let's talk first about trying to define climate change. You know, looking at some of the issues around who, what, when, where, and how. So let's first look at climate change. And just to point out that we are talking about climate change and not weather. Obviously, I think most people know the difference between that, but it turns out that everybody doesn't, right? The weather is what's preventing us from having the reception tonight outside. Climate is what's burning up Australia. And you got to think about this. Obviously, climate is the sum of weather over time. And it's important because, you know, people get into these very detailed substantive discussions about the difference. And we're really talking about what's happening to our planet over time. And weather is part of that. We're also talking about climate change versus global warming. And yeah, I know we tried to change the terminology a few years ago because global warming didn't quite capture it, but it's really always been about climate change. Global warming, again, like the difference between weather and climate, is one aspect of what's happening in this change that we're concerned about. Just remind you that we're living on a planet called Earth. It's got these gases around it, and they're called greenhouse gases, and they include a range of things. And carbon dioxide is one small portion of it, oxygen, nitrous oxide, sulfuric acid, a whole bunch of stuff that's in there. And it's a relatively thin layer as gases go, but it's very protective. It keeps us from burning up. It keeps the air breathable. It's something that's very special that helps us work in a very strong ecosystem with the sun. and I've now exhausted my entire knowledge from my physics class in college. But having said that, we know that in a normal situation, the sun comes up, it goes through these protective layers. As you can see, the greenhouse gas layer is in normal situations is relatively thin compared to the rest of the atmosphere, but it does help capture heat and other things that we want to have in our atmosphere. And heat is probably the most important thing that we want to just for you to think about. And that when we increase the greenhouse effect, we're in effect increasing the size of those greenhouse gases in relation to the rest of the atmosphere. And that results in trapping heat around the Earth in a variety of ways. In addition, we know that we're having a marked increase in carbon dioxide. We'll talk about that in a moment. It's one of the many greenhouse gases. It's the one that's captured our attention the most because it's easily measured. We've tracked it over time. And in many ways, it has probably the most destructive effect of all the greenhouse gases. But you understand there are many of them that occur. And I know that we get into big fights about greenhouse gases when we're talking with environmental agencies all the time. And I understand that, what comes out of your tailpipe isn't just carbon dioxide, it's a whole range of other greenhouse gases. But again, I want you to focus on carbon dioxide for a moment and recognizing that fossil fuels are a major source of that carbon dioxide. We often get asked, why is today heat increases and climate change different from many millions of years ago? We've also had increases in heat in the planet, and while I will admit I wasn't around then, what we do understand, of course, is that we continue to fuel this by fundamentally burning fossil fuels. So many of the activity that occurred thousands, millions of years ago was certainly natural in origin, natural by most geologists and scientists understanding. What's different is these pesky little things called people that have inhabited the planet and are now burning fossil fuels, and we in effect are accelerating the process in many ways, adding to what's a normal process. All parts of society, obviously, we need to have fuel. All parts of our society are involved in this. I just want to point out that we know about 10% of this is the health sector's contribution to greenhouse gases. That's not insignificant by any means. It's not a large amount, and you look at the whole diagram, but it's a significant part of the contribution. And of course, just to get an understanding of what that means to the environment itself, it's getting hotter, pure and simple. And as scientists have, to the extent we can, record the temperature over time, we're absolutely seeing this increase. This is, when people disagree with this, they're just wrong. We are getting hotter. And, understanding that it's not all over the place. The planet is a very dynamic structure with an amazing ecosystem, and there's a reason that we have multiple seasons. There's a reason why it's hot in some places and colder than others. Global surface temperatures are not the same all around the planet, and they're not the same in any part of our communities. But overall, we are getting warmer as a big issue. I was just in Alaska on a cruise and got the opportunity to tragically see the fact that the glaciers are indeed melting. There's no question that that's happening. Melting ice in a contained environment rises. Anybody who doesn't believe that, like some elected leaders, didn't pass high school science, is true. Ice melts, global sea level rises. Again, it's not rocket science. Heat causes challenges. And, the fires in California and the fires in Australia are just the beginning of those examples of what we're going to see as this process continues. I'm a rabid tennis fan, and I'm concerned a lot about the folks down there in the Australian Open. We've got the world's best tennis players down there, and there are already concerns about the air quality and their exposure in Australia because of the heat. The air is not in a contained box. It travels, and not just travels across city lines, it crosses state lines, it crosses country lines, it crosses oceans. Air quality is a big issue, particularly now that we're having this burning. And it's just, some of the arguments we're getting is just the fact that people forget the enormous progress we've made, particularly under the Clean Air Act, in improving the quality of our communities. And climate change is putting that in enormous peril. There's nothing you can say, being in this particular city, about severe storms. And the 100-year floods that we've had, they're now coming for their second and third year in other Midwestern cities. There's science to why that happens. It's real. We're having ice and snow in unusual places. This is Atlanta in 2014. Some of you may remember that ice storm, which came up very quickly. It doesn't take a lot of ice and snow to cause a huge wreck like this. We actually had people that slept in their cars all night on the expressway because they just couldn't get home. So ice and snow in unusual places, much more snow than usual in other places. And we're seeing huge snowstorms, snowfalls in places that are used to getting snow, but they're not used to getting that much snow that quickly. Significant impact on crops and food. So for Middle America, the lower crop yields because of the terrible growing conditions, too wet, too cold, the seasons are off. So farmers are having to do all kinds of amazing things to try to maintain their crops. And some of the interesting things is the nutrient content of the food is dramatically changed. It turns out, surprise, surprise, that the nutrient content is dependent on an ecosystem and the weather. That's not new. We've known that for many, many years, actually for thousands of years we've known that. And of course, seafood being impacted by the temperature and the salinity of the water and the amount of oxygen in the water. And one of the interesting things about bugs and animals and birds is that they are where they are and they do what they do because of the environment that they're in. And when that environment changes, a couple things happen. They either don't do well from a physical perspective, or they move. And so, of course, we're seeing infectious diseases that we haven't seen: Zika, dengue, chikungunya, malaria, in communities that used to not be so warm, but they're now much warmer. And the mosquitoes have left the places which weren't as appetizing before for new places. And I think some of you may have seen the news article just about, was it today, about iguana in Florida falling down and dying because they don't tolerate the cold weather very well. Ecosystem matters, weather matters. And of course it's expensive. I can tell you what I would do if someone wrote me a check for $35 billion. I can tell you a lot of things that I would do with that money. It's a lot of money. And the challenge we have is that a lot of this is preventable. Have we been paying attention and acting a a lot of this is preventable. So as I mentioned earlier, I care about the polar bears a lot, but I care about my grandchildren more. So as I think about what these risk and protective factors are, I try to look at it from the individual, community, and societal perspective. And one of the things that's real clear is that many of the people that are contributing the most to climate change are not necessarily the people that are having the greatest burden for climate change. And so we know that the climate burden is not shared equally across all communities. We have communities that are more climate sensitive than others. They recover slower. The economic burden and other challenges they have in day-to-day life makes it more challenging for them when they have a climate event. Community resilience, all communities have strengths, but some communities have more strengths than others. And there are many things that we can do to try to improve that. And you had some discussions today around some of the housing presentations that you had in the first panel that we had that really talked about health and how to improve the health of communities. What you were really having a conversation with, I think, was how to make communities more resilient. And at the end of the day, that's our challenge. Our challenge is how can you take a hit and keep on taking, return back to normality very quickly. And that's because where you live matters. Your zip code determines access to a whole range of things. It tells you what school you're in. It tells you the kind of housing, nutritious foods, access to quality health care, toxic exposure environments. And one of the interesting things about that is, somebody want to get it up here. Oops. Just a second, I gotta pop up there, I don't think you can see. No. Is that every community has zip code issues. So the way I look at it, think about where you grew up. And every community has a railroad track or main road that goes down some central road in your city. And as you go through that, past that railroad track, and you look left, you see one kind of quality community, and you look right, and you see another kind of quality community. It's visible. It's not hidden that we have enormous disparities in our communities. And one of the things we now know, because of some good research, is that we have inequity around how hot our communities are. We have some communities that are designed because they have more asphalt. They don't have many trees, they don't have parks, they're not walkable, bikeable, and green. It turns out that translates into them being hotter and less livable communities. And we've designed them that way. That may not have been the intent to design them to make them hotter, but that has been the result of designing those communities so that they ultimately are much hotter than others. And by the way, they have more crime, they have more violence, they have less investment. And that we have done. To see lack of investment, we have done on purpose. So let's talk about the impact of climate change on human health, recognizing that rising temperatures, increased CO2 levels, the sea level increase we talked about, and just the overall climate changes themselves result in all of those environmental things that I talked about earlier. And that they result ultimately in an enormous suite of negative health impacts. Again, in many cases affecting everyone, but in some communities disproportionately affecting those communities, which by the way, particularly underserved communities, communities of color, already have an enormous disparate health burden that don't tolerate these kinds of climate issues very well. So heat, obviously hotter and longer heating seasons and lots of heat waves, a whole range of heat-related illness that occurs from just simple fainting to cardiac arrest. Yes, we have people, we tell them not to go out and cut their lawns, and it's just hot. We have people that are living in facilities where they can't open the windows because it's unsafe to do so, because of the community that they're in. And of course, heat rises, particularly older folks that are living up. They have less access to water, they have less access to mobility. And so when this happens, we have higher morbidity and mortality because of the heat. It's often exacerbated by the air quality. We call them code red days, right? When we looked at both the humidity and the air quality together, and we tell people, warn them what you can do and what you can't do in your community. And of course, then we exacerbate that by the pollutants we put in the air when things burn, as we've seen with the fires in California. And people who have asthma or bronchospastic sensitive conditions don't do as well in those communities. And in fact, you don't have to be right on top of it, right? The number of people who, again, air moves and are remotely away from the immediate event have trouble when the air quality changes. Flooding is a problem, both too much rain and not enough rain. By the way, the mental health of all of these communities are impacted because it creates a range of environments in which people who are depressed have more challenges because of that. And that's whether it's heat waves or whether it's tornadoes, whether it's a preparedness event, all of those things result in challenges to our mental health. Flooding, with infections in the water supply, comes water that's not safe to drink. It's a big issue. You get flooding both from the rain when it falls too hard, or flooding in those communities. You get mold that again exacerbates people with asthma and creates a whole range of health impacts that often are picked up on the acute event, but over the next several weeks to months are exacerbated. We still have people in Texas and the Panhandle of Florida who are still suffering from those last storms that we had almost 2 years ago. We still have people living under tented properties. We have people living in facilities where there's still asthma problems and there's mold in their homes that have not had the resources to clean that up. So these are not acute events. These are not events that just kind of happen and they go away. But they're long-standing impacts, and they're cumulative over time because these events happen over time. The world went nuts when we saw those tragic children with microcephaly because of Zika virus. Those are the children that were born with small brains. What we have not paid a lot of attention to is the phenomenal number of other types of health impacts that have occurred because of Zika. We will begin to see those children who may have looked okay, but as they go through school, they may very well not be as okay as we would hope them to be because of that insult, because of Zika virus. And just like other parts of climate change, it's expensive. I would prefer to have $35 billion, but I can take the $10 billion as well. And there's lots of things I can do with this. We can improve the health and well-being of our communities if we had $10 billion more. Again, things that are probably fundamentally preventable. We should be engaged with this as well. So understanding those health impacts, what are some of the things that we can do? And I would argue, widespread adoption, moving to a green economy. I stole this definition of the green economy from that world expert source, Wikipedia. But I think most people's definition looks something like this. And it kind of just put them in the terms that most of us are using these days, under mitigation and adaptation as mechanisms to try to adjust this. But I want you to think through some of this as we talk about how we can address some of these issues as we go forward. Because you are very much interested in energy efficiency, let me just remind us all, in the spirit of all of those communities that are challenged, as we talk about trying to move them to clean energy, we should understand what their current energy state is for many of those communities. The fact that energy insecurity is still widely prevalent in our country, and it connects to housing instability, connects to food instability, and it ultimately contributes to poor health outcomes. So over a third of U.S. households reportedly face a challenge in paying their energy bills or sustaining simply having heat and cooling in their homes. This is likely to get worse as climate change and the planet warms in some places and cools in other places. This is likely to get worse over time. About 1 in 5 households report reducing basic necessities in order to pay their energy bill. Not a big number, but 14% is still a sizable number of people who get that little notice in the mail, and now they send you an email to let you know that they're going to cut off your energy service because you're late in payment or you're non-payment. And of course, cities have rules around when they can do it, when they shouldn't do it, but it still happens. That you always have, every year we have a couple stories of someone who shouldn't have had their power cut off due to non-payment in the middle of the winter, when it was a snowstorm or in a heat wave. And other people, some of us like me, try to reduce the temperature in our home because we're trying to conserve energy. And there are some people who, because of costs, have to reduce it far below the safety level. And we know that when you're looking at just kids, that far too many kids are in energy insecure places. They're likely to live in older homes, and this insecurity and paying for it has a disproportionate impact on their income, and that's obvious, but thought we needed to say that. And if you actually look at it, people who make more than $50,000, their energy costs only about 3% of their average after-tax income, and for a third of low-income households making less than $10,000. It's a big deal. And again, this is not unusual. Energy payments are regressive to your income, just the way it's structured. And so we got to find ways to do this. And of course, government has programs and processes to try to offset some of this, but we still probably have not done enough. And then when you put that summation together, the fact that folks are in older homes, that we as a society have not invested in those communities over a long period of time, that we really haven't enforced landlords. I'll come back to that in 1 second. And the landlords use low quality materials and often the cheapest refrigerators and stoves they can in those facilities. That's a challenge. And we do need to pay a lot more attention to landlords. I remember I was in Baltimore. I was a state health officer in Maryland for a few years, and the mayor and the city health commissioner in Baltimore decided they had enough of lead exposure in kids. We've had lead programs on the books for years in Baltimore City. We've screened kids, and we really weren't making great headway. And one of the challenges was that we couldn't get the landlords to actually pay attention to the existing laws on the books. So they put up a map of the whole city, and they looked at all the older housing in places where they actually knew kids had been lead exposed, and they put little red pins in all those places. And then they systematically went after those landlords, and over time, with good policies and good enforcement, because no one had ever enforced the rules, the whole map went from basically red to green as a way of targeting enforcement and targeting health outcomes, and we saw dramatic reductions in lead exposure to kids in Baltimore City. Data works, but also taking the laws we have on the books, which were put there for a reason, works. And yeah, we heard the landlords yell and scream, but they weren't paying those kids' health bills, and they weren't paying their education bills. I'm happy that we were able to enforce that over time. At the end of the day, the energy insecurity's impact on health shows that these folks at the end of the day have fewer educational opportunities, tend to have less access to fertile land. Overall, as I mentioned, they start with being in poor health, inadequate access to health services. If they had a politician in their pocket or they knew someone that they could work with, their world would be much better, but they often have less political clout and limited economic opportunities. And these kids are obviously at greater risk of having poor health outcomes. Many have been hospitalized at least once since birth, and of course are at risk ultimately of developmental delays, and we all pay for that, by the way. That ultimately gets paid for in your tax dollars. All those kids end up on special needs programs, either in the schools or through their health programs, and we all end up ultimately paying that bill. And as a society, we did this to ourselves, you know, for a variety of discriminatory reasons. And I used to be uncomfortable with the word racism, but I'm not uncomfortable with it anymore because that's why they did this. They didn't want folks like me living in their communities. I remember when I was, my dad died, and I finally took a chance to look at the deed on the house. And of course, like many of people in my generation, stamped on the back of that housing deed was that the home could not be sold to people of color. I use other terms, but that was the one that I'm comfortable with. And at the end of the day, the red line in the community profiling has continued. It continues in a variety of interesting ways. The tobacco industry and the alcohol industry learned about that many years ago, and the fossil fuel industry has picked up the mantle now. Right? If you go into communities, you go into these frankly, minority or civil rights organizations and or their publications, and you write them a check. You advertise them and their folks, and then you go into those communities and you try to convince folks that greening their communities is bad. And when you trace the money, it goes back to the fossil fuel industry. Okay? And I was just so proud of the NAACP at the national office telling its local chapters that it was a bad idea to let the industry manipulate them. I can't tell you who to take money from, but I can tell you that when they come in and they start telling things like, your energy bills are going to go up fivefold if you change the solar, that we need to have somebody that can come in and tell them a different story. And yeah, there may very well be some increase in energy costs. And if you're already energy insecure, that's a problem for you, okay? But what they don't tell you is that you're going to be dead, and that your kids are going to die prematurely, and that you're going to be sicker, okay? And so we've got to look at that whole equation, recognize we've got to help make that transition. That transition is not going to happen just because we wave and say solar is wonderful and the costs are coming down. That's not going to work. We've got to do this with an intentional manner, with deliberate plans to move to a green economy and help everyone do that. The richest amongst us and the poorest amongst us get there at the same time. And I like it. This is a list that came from the NAACP, pointed out in one of their articles. These are the top 10 tactics the fossil fuel industry uses, to invest in their perspective. And I just remind you that this is not new. I could have taken fossil fuel off the slide and put tobacco industry on that slide as well. But again, the idea is to co-opt those communities. And they call it marketing. I guess that is what it is. But in many ways, in my view, it has a corrosive impact on those communities in the long run. So what else can we do? Obviously, we can change what we eat. Less meat, more vegetables. For the purposes of me today, pizza is a vegetable. Buying more locally so food doesn't have to move as far. Putting up many, many more trees. Trying to reduce our energy usage and unplug. I know. We all have cell phones and an iPad and it's and an extra power pack. And I know if you were like I did last night, I had to find all the places in the room that I could plug these things in. And I was thinking about my carbon footprint. And I had to balance my carbon footprint, also being able to talk to my staff. So I burned a little extra energy, I admit it. Washing more clothes in cold water, looking for ways to try to reduce your carbon footprint at home. And we obviously need a lot more research around things that we can do improve better energy sources. We got to move away from fossil fuels, folks, as quickly as we possibly can. Walking more and driving less, moving closer to work and using mass transit when we can. That's a challenge. I know I have that challenge each and every day because I always have to go somewhere before work or after work, which isn't close to mass transit. But just thinking about recycling, consuming less, and being more efficient with our energy usage. And I'm going to bring up one other strategy. We've just joined something called the Smart Surfaces Coalition, trying to help people figure out how to build and upgrade to a cooler infrastructure. And I just thought when they approached this was kind of neat. So, how many people know about smart surfaces? Oh, that's wonderful, yeah. So, that's obviously the roofs were designed, they're all dark. They all absorb heat. So the idea is we increase the reflectivity of those buildings, adding the trees, putting roof gardens on, those kinds of things are very helpful. Even looking at the roads, trying to improve the roads and even adding solar roads. I didn't know about those things, but there are actually roads now that are solar in nature and you can walk on them, you can drive your car on. I guess they're relatively expensive, but the water comes through and they're porous. But there are ways that we can redesign communities to make them much more, basically cooler. And if you do that, we can cut carbon dioxide equivalent emissions by somewhere between 10 to 15%, and ultimately begin to reduce our fossil fuel use with that. Cities that can do this can better manage both sun and rain. So again, we've always talked about how to utilize the built environment in a more effective way. Those of you who are in housing, thinking about doing this as the core of your housing plans. And I know just speaking to my public health folks, we got to get to the builders and the designers of communities before they're putting their plans in front of City Council. For many reasons, that's too late because they've already gone through an enormous process of design, and redesigning anything is a challenge. So we've got to begin partnering very, very early across silos with engineers and architects and city planners to ultimately make this happen. If you think about the fact that I know every one of you has someplace in your city or town, you have an irritating road that they redo every year. I got 3 of them in my community. And what I can tell you is the fact that they're going to redo it means that the opportunity to put in a different road surface is there. And we have to figure out how to make it affordable and costly, but the opportunity is there to offset some of those costs. And if you look at the benefits overall of smart surfaces, this is a summary. So it certainly reduces costs, it creates jobs. And in many places, it's really an opportunity to move to the green economy. The obvious things around electric cars and selling green products and the recycling businesses are all great businesses that we know are growing in our community. I don't know what nuclear power's future is. One of these days, some 24-year-olds are going to figure out how to get rid of the nuclear waste, and when that happens, and we can shorten the timeline from building nuclear plants. Maybe that's in our future. But right now, it's too controversial and probably not an obvious thing in our future. There are great polls out there that say, the public cares about climate change, and I believe every one of those polls, okay? So that's not the question that I'm asking here. The question is it a top priority? And the answer is not necessarily a top priority. It's not a kitchen table issue yet. And one of APHA's goals is to try to make it a kitchen table issue so that Uncle John and Auntie Sue are sitting around and, talking about it over the kitchen table and figuring out what they can do to engage in this process over time. And we know that it's fundamentally a barrier to action. Again, when you look at all the other things, doesn't mean that in political campaigns, the public says we want somebody who's going to lead on climate change. We want our government to do something on climate change. That's absolutely real. But when you put it up stack, whether or not I'm going to get my kids off to school I got to feed my family, I got to pay my energy bill. It doesn't necessarily become top of mind as when and life is always about trade-offs when we have to do that. So we've got to figure out how to change the political calculus here. I encourage each and every one of you to get politically motivated. First of all, I should have put in here vote. Okay? If anything else, vote. I ain't gonna tell you who to vote for, but if you want, I'm outside. I'll give you my advice. We're a 501c3, so we don't encourage political campaign. But if you ask me personally, I would have to. Hey, educate your family and neighbors around climate change and need to go to a new energy environment. Encourage your employer to go green. Advocate for climate-friendly policy and regulations at the local and national level. Isn't that easy? It really isn't easy. Okay, we've been moving at APHA at our headquarters trying to move that. We've done some things to move our meeting to be more green, but it is not easy business. But we gotta continue to work at it. We gotta continue to work faster than we're doing today. Supporting policymakers that prioritize climate issues, and go to those rowdy town hall meetings. We're going to have several over the next 10 to 11 months to inform policymakers on your perspectives on green energy and climate change and health issues. At the end of the day, it's very, very important. I love the polar bears, but I love my grandchildren. With that, I thank you. I'll be happy to take questions. Questions? Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Shah from the DC Department of Health. I guess my question, something that you said struck me, which was if you had $10 billion or $25 billion, what could you really do in this to address this topic? And I think my response would be those dollars can be out there, especially from the federal level. Maybe in the next 3 or 5 years, there could be a federal response to health effects or health response to climate change. And my question is really, is this an opportunity for APHA and other organizations to spell out a blueprint for what you would actually invest in if you had a $10 billion or $20 billion blueprint for the feds to invest to actually mitigate this crisis? So kind of being very specific, agency specific about where those dollars could go and how to be invested in communities.
Yeah, great idea. And let me say a couple of things. This country is interesting. We pay for what we want to pay for, and we don't pay for what we don't want to pay for, okay? And if you give me 15 minutes, maybe 20 with the federal budget, I could probably find you that $10 billion to reinvest. And by the way, $10 billion is not even what we call budget dust, right, in the federal budget. So we can easily find that. But the principle is you're correct, and yeah, we probably ought to do that. And Rachel, let's talk about that when we get back. That's not a bad idea. I know there are people looking at the next public health agenda for the next administration in Congress, but I think that's a great idea to do that. So we'll steal your idea. I know where you are. We're right down. Other questions?
Down here.
Yes, sir. And then,
You know a lot about how politics works, and the APHA is involved in a lot of this stuff. How do we get our big healthcare institutions to put their lobbying money behind climate instead of more prosaic issues like bashing hospitals or bashing HMOs and all the things that health professionals do to protect themselves?
so let's talk about that. Let me acknowledge that there are some health systems that have begun to actively be involved in addressing climate. I give kudos to the Kaiser Permanente Group and to Dignity Health and to Yatzinger, and there are a few others that are really taking this issue because they own a lot of facilities, they own a lot of real estate. They understand that they can reduce their energy costs, they can improve healthier employees, and they have such a big footprint in terms of people that they care for or ensure that it is, they've done the math, and they know that that's good for them. So we're having this discussion right now about population health. And I continue to tell my colleagues on the healthcare delivery side that population health is not a social services referral. And I tell them that it's wonderful that they're buying housing and helping the homeless getting into more affordable homes. In some cases, buying property and working with people that are in their catchment area or their enrollees to do that. But I have argued that that's important for them to do, because that's what they know how to do, is care for individual patients, maybe 2 or 3 at a time. But they would be a lot more effective, in my view, being the unanticipated messenger and showing up at the energy hearing and the housing hearing and arguing for effective policies that affect the whole population to move the bar. So you're absolutely right. I mean, some of those lobbyists make more than my whole wardrobe per hour. But it's still cheap compared to what, buying a house and trying to get a homeless person in it. Building more housing stock and spending other people's money through policy and doing good, smart policies is, I think, a more effective way. Demanding that we move to green energy. Saying that, we're not going to put our new health center into your community unless you create an environment that we think is healthy. So we want health policies and community policies and healthy environmental policies where we're going to put our plants. Amazon, Google, big business. If big business did that, including the health community, we would make enormous progress. So I think the things that they're doing are wonderful, but you're right, more lobbyists coming on the issues that affect broader populations in a broader way is a much more effective way to do that. Yes, ma'am.
Cassandra Cubes, EPA. You've been speaking a lot to work at the federal level, and I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to the work that APHA is doing at the state level, particularly with the state affiliate groups, and any work that's been done or planned work on advancing clean energy policies at the state level.
Well, on the built environment side, we've worked with the American Planning Association through our affiliates at the local level to try to build more collaborative coalitions to address the built environment. We have some grants that have gone out through our affiliates on climate change and health and trying to encourage our members locally to be more involved and helping them link to multidisciplinary groups as well, at the state and local level, to be more involved in that. And then every summer, when members of Congress go home for the summer, we send home a list of advocacy points. And we do it through the affiliates in particular, but it goes out to all of our members on ideas to try to encourage members of Congress to be more climate friendly. And those are three obvious ones that we do all the time. Yes, sir.
After literally decades of operating in their own silos, the medical and health community and the energy community are finally starting to have these kind of interchanges, and this conference is just a really great example of a catalyst in that area. But the real sweet spot that people are looking for is ways to combine health sector related funding and energy sector related funding. We know how to do healthy home retrofits that can save energy and improve the health of occupants. The question is, how can we get large amounts of commitment to make that happen? Do you have any thoughts on how the health, medical side of things can help merge in with the energy side?
Yeah, well, I think the example with big health systems doing that, because they have both an energy concern as well as a health concern, health insurance companies. I think at the elected government level, having the economic development people, or to the extent that whoever's in charge of energy at at the state or for big metropolitan cities, city level, basically pulling everybody into a room and saying, hey, how can we do this? And understanding that we're all very good at saying our dollars can't go for that. And there are barriers sometimes that prevent those dollars from going for that. But my experience over the many years is that while there are certainly some barriers, most of it we've made up. And so we just need to make sure we know what the rules really are. And then particularly with federal dollars, there's lots of waiver programs which allow us to do things. And then when we can't spend dollars A for health, on the more construction, housing, energy side of the house, there's always an opportunity for us to leverage them together in a meaningful way. And quite commonly, we just have to make sure that Agency A's policies don't undermine Agency B's policies. And that happens, as you may know, far, far too often in government and, in fact, in any kind of big bureaucratic organization. So you need leadership from the top to do that, and you've got to get everybody in the room. And when something marvelous happens when you bring in multidisciplinary, cross-sector folks focused on a target, magic happens and people get better, and they often get better at a lower cost, or if there is more money, the incremental cost of getting there is much, much less than it would be if everybody had to do it by themselves. Sir.
I'm going to follow up on Marty's question. And it's a little political, and I hope it's okay, but you can keep it at a level that is comfortable. You said one of the best things we can do is vote. So we have decisions upon us as Americans coming forward where we're thinking about candidates who are offering different healthcare proposals. And I'm thinking, looking at the very, very focused lens of this community where we're trying to create this intersection between health and energy efficiency and help it to propel home improvements going forward, is there a healthcare system that is more likely to foster that relationship compared to others?
Yeah, first of all, I don't know, because I don't know enough about the systems.
Fair.
I praise Kaiser because I knew Bernard Tyson, who just recently tragically passed away, and I knew what he was doing on this issue. And I was kind of watching him from afar and kind of being the cheerleader behind the scenes. And the folks at Dignity, I know their CEO as well. So there's a few systems in which I personally knew somebody that has been raising the flag. I'm blocking. What's the organization, Rachel? Healthcare Without Harm is a nonprofit, has been on the forefront of working with the nonprofit community. And my advice would be to work with Healthcare Without Harm to have them work with that community as well to make them help them be more effective engaging, because they are right on top of this, working with the medical community. So I don't know that I would grab a particular health system as much as I would. They're a national organization, they're very effective, and they're working with all of the early adopters, and they're working very, very hard to try to get some of the folks that are kind of right on the cusp of trying to move that agenda forward. The other thing I would do is obviously push all the political candidates. I'm pretty sure I can say that as long as I don't say which ones. To a green energy future. And the way you do that is you show up at their town halls and you say, "What is your policy here?" And try to encourage them. And they tell you what they need to tell you for the evening, but we got to hold them to what they say. And then after the election, we've got to make sure that the kinds of folks that are put in these jobs are going to protect the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, restore the integrity of the EPA, push HHS to be an early adopter of these kinds of things, achieve universal coverage. But it's going to require us to go back to our civics lessons. Vote, vote, vote. If you know somebody who didn't vote the last time, by the way, there were a few of them out there. drag them to the polls with you. Voting is probably the most important thing that any of us can do. Again, I'm not telling you who to vote for, but I am going to tell you voting, because if you don't vote, you voted.
Dr. Benjamin, thank you for your comments, first and foremost. And I had the opportunity to speak with a group of students on Monday, Dr. Martin Luther King Day. And one of their questions was, how do we begin to shift the narrative of no hope around addressing climate change to one where there is hope, knowing that these students, they were from health, they were from engineering, planning, again, coming with a lot of diverse perspectives. But in shifting that narrative, also remembering and being intentional about racism and how that plays out in the solution sets that we choose. So wondering, because APHA works with so many different types of folks, how do you suggest for folks in this room that we begin to shift that narrative in a way where we're talking about solutions, but also recognizing that our solutions can cause unintentional consequences for certain groups?
Don't thank you for that. Yeah, and I tried today to tell you the bad stuff and then try to offer a whole list of solutions. And I think we've got to change the dialogue so that it's not doom and gloom, but it's doom and gloom and solutions. It's very, very important for us to do. I think we also have to recognize, and when I am asked that, I tell them that I remind them that I'm old, and when I was did internal medicine, and when I went to medical school, that most kids who had leukemia died. We gave them all kinds of poisons, but they still died. No matter what we did, they died. They died of the chemotherapy. They died of the infections because we dropped their white blood, because they died. And today it is unusual for a kid with leukemia to die. We understand the solutions are there. We know what not to do. So I think the hopeful thing we can tell them is we know what not to do. And we stop burning fossil fuels. It will take a while, even if we stop right now today. But we can reverse this, and we're a resilient species, and so we can live through this. But we've got to stop right now, and we got to move with all deliberate speed. And then I think the other thing is probably us old folks need to get out of these kids' way, because I've always kind of joked about they want to be president right away and in charge of the company right away. I'm getting to believe that maybe I just ought to get out of their way and let them do it, because they sure have a lot more sense than we do. Thank you very much, everyone.